It has now been 1 year since Britain first went into lockdown, and throughout this period, it's been this man, Rishi Sunak, who has steered the British economy through the crisis. He is currently the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but is the favourite to replace Boris Johnson if and when the PM steps down. Now that's pretty impressive considering he's only 40, and most people hadn't even heard of him until he became Chancellor, which was around the same time the coronavirus first hit the UK. He's led the economy through this difficult period quite well by most accounts, but he's also been blamed for a jump in COVID cases last summer when he was encouraging everyone to eat out to help out, a photo op he might just regret. He's also been accused of being less than upfront about his own finances. His wife, Akshata Murthy, is said to be wealthier than the Queen, and Mr Sunak faces questions about their business interests. We'll be hearing from a raft of guests later in the programme, including the former journalist Prasanto Roy, who attended their wedding in Bangalore. But first, this quick report on the rise and rise of Rishi Sunak. The papers call him Dishy Rishi on account of his sharp suits and easy manner. He calls himself something rather different.
Yeah, I'm a coke addict. Total coke addict. I'm a coke addict. Total coke addict. Coca-Cola addict. Yes, I was going to say.
The headline writers had a great laugh at his expense, but generally, Rishi Sunak is as polished as they come. He only entered Westminster in 2015 and is already Chancellor and favourite to be the next PM. How did it all go so right? Well, some say he was born to be a leader, but it's more likely down to his very privileged upbringing. His parents, a doctor and a pharmacist, sent him to Winchester College, one of the most expensive schools in Britain, which today costs $56,000 a year. And young Rishi made the most of it, becoming head boy and editor of the school newspaper. And from then on, it was textbook elite. He got a first from Oxford, worked at Goldman Sachs, and then an MBA from Stanford, which was where he met his future wife, Akshata Murthy, the daughter of one of India's richest men, billionaire Narayana Murthy, founder of Infosys. The press noted she was richer than the Queen.
Yes.
Now, they married in 2009, and Sunak went to work at his father-in-law's hedge fund, Catamaran Investments. In 2015, aged 35, he entered Westminster for the first time, having been elected MP for Richmond in North Yorkshire.
And although I am not from Yorkshire, they were immensely relieved to learn that I was not from Lancashire either.
He was a strong supporter of Brexit in the 2016 referendum and would go on to vote for then Prime Minister Theresa May's withdrawal agreement on all three occasions. That didn't go so well.
I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold. I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
With Theresa May out of the way, Rishi Sunak supported the blonde bombshell for leader of the Conservative Party.
He has a way of engaging the public, and it's because he speaks in a way that they understand, that's direct, that gets through to them.
Rishi Sunak of the Conservative Party.
Boris would often put Rishi out in front during the 2019 election debates. The Conservatives won by a landslide.
Let's get Brexit done. But first, my friends, let's get breakfast done too. Thank you all. Thank you all very much for coming.
Smooth operator Rishi was rewarded in February 2020 with the Chancellorship, put in charge of the country's finances just as the coronavirus landed on the UK's shores.
I have a responsibility to make sure that we protect as far as possible people's jobs and incomes. Today, I can announce that for the first time in our history, the government is going to step in and help to pay people's wages.
His big idea was to support people while they couldn't work during the lockdown with the so-called furlough scheme. It's been broadly a success, didn't cover everyone, and is going to cost a fortune. Criticism tends to slip off Dishy Rishi, but occasionally it sticks. Did he do the wrong thing by encouraging people to eat out to help out? Some experts say coronavirus cases may have jumped 17% as a result. And what of his own finances? The Committee on Standards in Public Life has been asked to look at whether he's been transparent about his family's wealth. But there's no whiff of scandal, not like his boss, Bojo. OK, let's take a look at Rishi Sunak's record as Chancellor now with our guests, Francis Coppola, who is an economist and financial blogger, Freddie Gray, who is the deputy editor of The Spectator magazine, and later we'll be hearing from the former journalist Prasanto Roy, who went to Rishi Sunak's wedding in Bangalore and knows all about the Chancellor's fabulously wealthy in-laws. Very interesting part of this story. Freddie, I'd like to come to you first of all. Is it realistic to expect Rishi Sunak to be the next Prime Minister of this country?
It is. It's very feasible. I think if you were to put a betting market on it, he'd be right at the top. I mean, the extraordinary thing about Rishi Sunak is his ability not to make enemies. He's existed in the Tory party during a very fractious time, whether it's over Brexit, also over the pandemic and a big fallout between Boris Johnson and his closest advisors. And yet he's just sort of glided through and always seemed to come out on top. And he's not hated within Westminster, which is an extraordinary achievement for someone who's become Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yes, it's like running through a burning house and not singeing your eyebrows somehow. Francis, let's look at, we know he's smooth, but is he competent at his job as a Chancellor?
Well, I think the evidence so far is that broadly he is competent at his job. I mean, I hate to think what would have happened if we'd had somebody who wasn't competent at their job, or at least wasn't capable of recognising the enormity of the task they were facing and rising to that challenge. And he definitely did. So, yeah, on that, I'm inclined to give him a bit of a, yeah, he did all right.
And when you compare the performance of the economy to, say, other G7 or the European Union, how would you rate it?
Well, we had to set it in the context of how the UK has responded to COVID, because that's been the economic challenge. And we've had an almighty kicking, and that's been at least part because of bad policy decisions elsewhere in government. I'm a little bit inclined to let the Chancellor off because the economy could be a whole load worse than it is if it wasn't for the exceptional measures taken by the Chancellor.
Exceptional measures like the furlough scheme. Can you just explain that to our international viewers who are not aware of it?
Well, the furlough scheme, or the job retention scheme as it should be known, basically pays employers an amount to cover most of the wages of staff whom, for whatever reason, they're not able to deploy productively, either because they've had to close down completely or because they've severely had to curtail the work that they're doing. And it's really enabled those workers to stay attached to their jobs so they haven't become unemployed. It's kept their incomes supported so we haven't had a total demand crash. And it's also kept firms alive. Who otherwise might have struggled because, had they tried to keep workers, carried on paying them with no income.
But of course, this all has to be paid for eventually, doesn't it, Francis? And it says here that the combined total of every deficit, the national debt, has gone now above $2 trillion, which is equivalent to more than 100% of GDP. Is it going to be painful years ahead for the United Kingdom?
Not immediately. But I think at some stage there will have to be a pullback. But the consensus among economists right now is that what we should be trying to do is restore growth, because you should remember that your debt to GDP figure and even the deficit to GDP figure, which actually looks even worse, are ratios. If you can get growth up, if you can increase GDP, then your debt to GDP and your deficit to GDP fall. And that is what we should be looking at now, is how do we get GDP up again?
Well, you're all being very nice about him. Keir Starmer has tried very hard to be more critical. Let's have a quick listen to him.
I'm sure this budget will look better on Instagram. In fact, this week's PR video cost the taxpayer so much I was half expecting to see a line in the OBR forecast for it. But even the Chancellor's film crew will struggle to put a positive spin on this. After the decisions of the last year and the decade of neglect, we needed a budget to fix the foundations of our economy, to reward our key workers, to protect the NHS and to build a more secure and prosperous economy for the future. Instead, what we got was a budget that papered over the cracks rather than rebuilding the foundations. A budget that shows the government doesn't understand what went wrong in the last decade or what's needed in the next.
Well, that was Keir Starmer there, the leader of the opposition, saying that it wasn't really a budget to fix the fundamentals of the UK economy. What do you think, Freddie?
Well, I think it's hard for Labour at the moment to criticise the Tories because traditionally Labour have been the state interventionist party, and it's been almost impossible to be to the left of the British government during the pandemic because we're in a sort of wartime situation against a virus in which huge government intervention is needed, as we've just been discussing. I don't think Labour have managed to land any significant blows on Rishi so far. The questions will start coming when the pain or possible pain comes later. And we look at things like the furlough scheme and we see whether it actually supported a lot of jobs that are no longer there. And there could be a lot of pain in the post. I think in terms of, it's been a very difficult and challenging time for him. He's risen to the challenge. But in a way, the real pain is going to come later. And that's where the gleam can start to come off Rishi a little bit and Labour can really get at him a bit later on.
The 1% pay rise for NHS workers, I mean, that was seen as derisory by them and also a great section of the British public.
Well, yes, but then you do have to set that against, outrageous levels of government spending on every front for the last year. Rishi is the only person often within the cabinet who is calling for a bit of fiscal restraint. And I think that is to be commended because we can't keep up this level of government spending for very much longer.
Yeah. Francis, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, where the government basically subsidised people to go out and eat at restaurants, that was blamed potentially for increasing COVID cases in the United Kingdom. Is that a correct accusation, first of all? And secondly, as a sort of tool to stir the economy up, was it effective?
I think it probably was responsible to some extent for an increase in cases. As a tool to stimulate the economy, it's not a bad idea. After all, the whole problem with the COVID pandemic is that it's hitting industries like restaurants, hospitality. So anything that actually gets people out again, eating out, spending money in that industry is a good thing if your pandemic is actually on its way out. The problem is that he was doing it when it actually wasn't. And I think that was, again, to do with expectations that the pandemic would be over more quickly than was actually the case.
A final question before we move on to Prasanto, Freddie. The UK government's ethics watchdog has been asked to assess if Rishi Sunak breached the ministerial code by not declaring the register in the register of ministerial interests a multi-million-pound portfolio of shares held by his wife and family. That was back in November, which the Guardian newspaper was stirring up. Do we know if that has gone anywhere and if it is going to affect his standing?
I think it seems like the Guardian story was, again, a bit of a damp squib. And again, I'm sorry to keep saying this, points to this fact that he's very, very squeaky clean. Yeah. And considering how rich he is and how privileged his upbringing, to me, he always strikes me as the opposite of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, there are so many skeletons in every cupboard, personal, financial, whatever. Rishi, I know someone who had to research a book about him, and she was very depressed to find that there really isn't anything. Journalistically, he's very boring.
Prasanto, boring for journalists, but squeaky clean is the takeaway there. Many Brits have been quite stunned, though, to find out fairly recently that his wife is richer than the Queen. Can you tell us a little bit about Akshata Murthy and her family?
Well, the family is, Narayana Murthy is considered probably one of the maybe top 3 or 4 greatest entrepreneurs of our time. That's been, Fortune magazine said that. A lot of us do believe that here. First generation entrepreneurs set up Infosys Technologies with, 6 other software professionals. It's the second largest infotech company now for a very long time in India. So pretty brilliant. And, unlike some of the other companies, he's kept this largely professionally managed. His son Rohan Murthy had joined for a while and then moved on to other things. They're philanthropists, which, you don't get a lot of the high-profile industrialists here in India. very significant philanthropic contributions. Pretty impressive record. And like, we heard about Rishi Sunak, he's also been fairly diplomatic, not made a lot of enemies. Well, you can't not have any enemies at all in this position, but he's maintained a very good relationship with the two very different governments who've been there before this present government, which is right-wing, and, the left liberal Congress-led government in the past. So and pretty balanced and, great performance in the various things he's done apart from Infosys too.
And Akshata Murthy, I mean, she's said to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Is that through some active role in the company or what?
No, it would be through shareholding, and that's the same with Sudha Murthy, Akshata's mother, and Rohan Murthy, Akshata's brother. Not any active role. Rohan, of course, did have an active role for a few years in Infosys, but there'd be shareholding that they have. So
and how is Rishi Sunak seen in India?
Well, Rishi Sunak actually wasn't very well known until recent years, except, of course, in 2009 when a lot of people heard about him for the first time. And frankly, that's the only time I met him at his wedding. And, then the question was, who's the person marrying into, the Narayan Murthy family? And now in recent times, with his role as chancellor in the UK, a lot of people have found out more about him. But to that extent, Akshata would have been better known in past years as the daughter of Narayan Murthy than Rishi Sunak would have been.
All right. And a final question for you, Prasanth. You mentioned you went to the wedding. Most of us would assume if you're a billionaire in India, it would be an incredible production. But actually, it was quite a modest affair.
It was actually, and I think that speaks to the Murthy's, fairly elegant, understated taste. Narayan Murthy was famously a communist, by inclination and belief. Before he had a terrible experience in one of the communist countries in Bulgaria. He was on a train, Serbia, Bulgaria. He was arrested. He was in jail for five days and without food, apparently. So that completely changed his views on communism and communist countries. So he set up Infosys. I think it's been really kind of spectacular what he's been able to achieve, and it's been a very inspirational story for a lot of people. Not just him, but his wife Sudha Murthy, who runs a couple of foundations, does a lot of work for. She's an author. She writes children's books. So it's quite an inspirational family. Now, Narayan Murthy came back into a sort of an executive chairman role after Infosys went through some troubles. So he's been seen as, a fairly stable, reliable, and fairly balanced kind of figure out there in the Indian infotech industry. And it's the second largest company. I think it's worth about $300 billion or so, 600th largest public company in the world.
Right. Well, Prasanth Roy, Freddie Gray, and Francis Coppola, thank you all for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. Well, take a look at the British government led by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and you'll notice that Rishi Sunak is one of 3 Asians in the cabinet, along with Priti Patel and Alok Sharma. All are British Indians with Hindu background, and their families all moved to the UK in the 1960s and 70s, as did many others. Today, Indians make up something like 2.5% of the UK's total population. And according to government statistics, British Indians, on average, are performing very well by most socio-economic measures. For example, they have the highest level of average net property wealth in the country at around $244,000, and that's the value of property minus the mortgage. That's far higher than white British and Pakistani households, which lag behind on $159,000. They're almost at the top of the employment ladder. 76% of 16 to 64-year-olds are employed, only 1 percentage point less than white British, and well ahead of other Asian groups, including Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, who are on around 56%. Okay, let's bring in our final 2 guests now. We have Muhammad Amin with us. He's the former chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum. He left the party once Boris Johnson took over. And Anita Kapoor is a former London Conservative councillor. Well, Anita, let's start with you. You'll have noticed that we've been talking about how well Rishi Sunak's done. And in fact, of course, he's joined by Priti Patel, Alok Sharma. It's called in this Guardian article I've been reading the most British Indian cabinet in history. Is there a reason why British Indians with a sort of Hindu culture are doing as well as they are in the Conservative Party right now?
You see, I'm always worried when people say Hindu or Muslim, because at the end of the day, we've had Sajid Javid. Nobody said, oh, we've got a lot of Muslims in the Conservative Party. Those people are born here, they've worked very hard to get where they are, and they're very capable. And as I said, during the pandemic, when I myself have lost people, Rishi has done a great job, and we are all very grateful for the little bits that we got to help us live and survive.
Generally speaking, the Conservative Party isn't that popular with people from ethnic minorities, but British Indian Hindus tend to favour them more than the others, with the exception of the Jewish community. What is it about the Conservative Party that attracts you, for example?
For me, I've been in the Conservative Party for nearly 40 years. What attracted me, socialism is always wonderful when you're playing with somebody else's money. I've worked very hard. I'd like to have the benefits of 2 or 3 jobs that I have done, and also feel that I'm compassionate. As a society, we all have to chip in. But at the end of the day, if you've got nothing to chip into, well, we've got to have people with money in every party, because they're the ones that actually make the economy work.
Mohammed Amin, I just want to ask you, I mean, you were a member of the Conservative Party, of course, but you left when Boris Johnson joined. You didn't feel he was the right man to lead the party. But generally speaking, the Conservative Party hasn't been that popular with Muslims. Why is that?
I think you need to distinguish between Muslims who came to the UK from Pakistan and Bangladesh, who tend to be poorer than average, compared to people of Indian origin, whether Muslim or Hindu, who came from East Africa. And I think you would find far higher levels of conservative support amongst Asians of East African descent than you would from people who'd come directly from the subcontinent. The people from East Africa had been middle class, upper class, and have been therefore more successful economically in the UK on average than people from Pakistan. I mean, I was born in Pakistan, so I'm not saying it's a universal truth, but I'm talking about averages.
Mohammed, is life essentially more difficult for Muslims than British Indian Hindus in the United Kingdom?
I think it depends on the level of religiosity. So I, for example, don't drink alcohol, but I have no problems going to a pub. If a group of people I know are going to a pub, I'll drink orange juice or mineral water and chat with them. But there are Muslims who won't go to a place where other people are drinking alcohol. And in that situation, you can very quickly find that you are self-excluding yourself from the network of people in your company. And that clearly isn't good for your career.
Anita, Mohammed was just noting that it can affect the advancement of your career if you are a Muslim, especially if you're a strict Muslim in the United Kingdom.
Well, maybe that's something that the young people have to change. Maybe the parents have to change their attitudes towards how they bring up their kids. And I own a pub in Wolverhampton. What can I say? I come from a very poor background. My parents were refugees from when Pakistan was made. My dad came here. My mum worked in factories. I was the youngest one, actually, of any of our women who started working and saying, no, it's not good enough for me to sit at home. I need to help my mum. So I went out to work at the age of 16, which was unheard of in those days. But then I am wild. I just feel that if women have to progress, some of us have had to go beyond the limits of what we were taught by our parents or programmed by our culture.
Mohammed?
Strongly supportive of women participating in the workforce. I encourage it very strongly.
Just a final question for both of you, because we're running out of time, sadly. But we've been here before, haven't we, Mohammed, with Sajid Javid? We actually did a whole programme on him. Do we think he's going to be the next Prime Minister of Britain? What chances would you give Rishi Sunak of reaching the very top?
At the moment, it's looking good. The real challenge for Rishi, I think, will be that if there is a leadership election, the last two chosen by members of parliament go out for voting amongst Conservative Party grassroots members. And we know from polling by YouGov that the membership of the Conservative Party has a very large number of what can only be described as xenophobic bigots.
Well, on that point, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. Mohammed Amin and Anita Kapoor, thank you both so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.